Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that honestly sounds incredibly mundane at first glance, an administrative diary. Just a standard, everyday logbook. Back in 1652, the Dutch East India Company, this massive, incredibly powerful global trading entity known as the VOC, sent a man named John van Riebeeck down to the southern tip of Africa. His main job? Well, it was just to set up a simple refreshment station for ships passing through. And they gave him a very specific bureaucratic instruction: keep a daily ledger. Literally, just write down what happens every single day. But, as we're going to see, this everyday logbook inadvertently became the official record of a truly profound historical shift. So, let's get right into it. How exactly did a simple daily diary capture the birth of a divided society? That's the core question we are answering today. You see, Van Riebeeck's bureaucratic ledger unintentionally chronicled a massive, violent collision of worlds at the Cape. What started out as a boring log of weather patterns and vegetable harvests quickly morphed into a real-time account of displacement, conflict, and the foundations of a deeply divided society. Section 1. Before the Dutch arrived. Now, before we look at what the VOC built, we really have to understand what was already there. If you look further east, African farmers were cultivating crops like sorghum and millet in the summer rainfall regions. But around the Cape itself, the very area Van Riebeeck would soon be documenting, indigenous groups had already thrived for literally thousands of years. We're looking at two distinct indigenous groups who shared very similar linguistic roots, sometimes collectively referred to as the Khoisan. On one hand, you have the Khoikhoi, a name meaning men among men. They were nomadic, highly skilled herders living right along the coastal regions, and they used copper and iron tools that they got through trade. On the other hand, you have the San, meaning people different from ourselves. They lived further inland, in smaller groups. They didn't keep animals at all. They were nomadic hunter-gatherers, relying on wild plants and hunting with poisoned arrows. And they left behind this incredibly rich heritage of rock paintings. While they had distinct lifestyles, the historical sources do note that they often clashed over natural resources long before any European ships even appeared on the horizon. Section 2. The VOC and the Journal. So why did the Dutch show up at the Cape in the first place? Well, it all comes down to the European scramble for a direct sea route to trade in the East. The Portuguese, specifically explorers like Diaz and da Gama, first discovered this sea route back in the late 1400s. By 1602, the VOC was founded to completely dominate it, and they eventually became the wealthiest and most powerful trading entity in the world at that time. But there was a major problem. The journey from Europe to the East Indies took months, and sailors were dying in huge numbers from scurvy. It's a horrific disease caused by a lack of vitamin C. Then, in 1647, a Dutch ship called the Haarlem shipwrecks in Table Bay. The surviving sailors actually make it back to Holland and report, hey, the Cape has fertile land, fresh water, and plenty of wild animals. Realizing this was the absolute perfect halfway point to combat scurvy, the VOC sends Jan van Riebeeck, who arrives in 1652 with about 90 people, to set up a permanent refreshment station. The explicit nature of the VOC's plan here is fascinating. They absolutely did not want to colonize. In fact, they generally avoided colonization unless it was strictly necessary to protect their trade. Their instruction to Van Riebeeck was incredibly simple. Build a fort, plant a garden to grow fresh fruit and veggies for the passing ships, and keep a daily record to send back to the Netherlands. Basically, they just wanted a glorified pit stop. But as you can probably guess, reading the journal quickly reveals a massive reality check. There was a stark contrast between neat corporate planning in the Netherlands and the harsh realities on the ground in Africa. Van Riebeeck records that things just did not go well. Winter floods literally washed away their original mud and clay fort. Strong southeasterly winds absolutely decimated their wheat crops. The VOC employees, who were just sailors and soldiers on harsh contracts, were struggling to even survive. Desperate for fresh meat, they had no choice but to establish trade with the local Khoikhoi and San. These early micro-struggles, recorded in the diary, really set the stage for a massive structural shift in policy. Section 3. Free burgers and conflict. Because the refreshment station was basically failing under the labor of these exhausted, disgruntled sailors, Van Riebeeck made a monumental decision that changed the Cape forever. In 1657, he actually allowed some VOC employees to break their strict contracts and become independent farmers. 9 of these men, who were now called freeburgers, were handed plots of land along the Liesbeek River. They were essentially given a startup package by the VOC, farming implements, guns, ammunition, and a 12-year tax break. But of course, there was a catch. They had to sell all their farm produce straight back to the VOC, and they were strictly, expressly forbidden from enslaving the local indigenous people. Now, Van Riebeek's daily records track exactly how fast this escalated into a much larger conflict. Word gets back to Europe about this free land, right? So, step 1. Dutch immigrants start arriving specifically to claim farms. Step 2. In 1688, French Huguenots, these are Calvinist refugees fleeing religious persecution back in France, arrive and they bring highly specialized skills in growing grapes and making wine. Step 3. This influx of people causes farming to expand rapidly across the landscape, which leads to a bunch of new towns popping up. And then step 4, the tragic but completely inevitable consequence documented right there in the journals, the Khoikhoi, those skilled nomadic herders we talked about earlier, rapidly lose their traditional grazing lands. This caused immense worry and conflict as they were systematically displaced by European agriculture. Section 4. The introduction of slavery. As these massive farms expanded to cultivate wheat and vineyards, the free burghers suddenly demanded intense, heavy labor. And the Khoikhoi naturally flat out refused to work the very land that had just been taken from them. This labor shortage led directly to one of the darkest chapters recorded in the Cape's history. The dark irony here is hard to ignore. Because the VOC strictly forbade the enslavement of the local indigenous people, they essentially solved their labor crisis by simply importing enslaved people from outside the Cape. This established a brutal transoceanic slave trade right at the southern tip of Africa, beginning as early as 1657. 63,000. Let that staggering number just hang in the air for a second. That is the total number of enslaved individuals brought to the Cape between 1657 and 1808. 63,000 human lives violently uprooted, just to serve the agricultural and domestic needs of this rapidly growing settlement. And the sheer brutality of this process, it literally cannot be overstated. Let's just look at the very first slave ship that arrived at Cape Town, the Amersfoort. 250 people were originally captured in Angola by a Portuguese slave trader. By the time that ship actually limped into the Cape, only 170 people had survived the voyage. They were crammed below deck in terrible, unthinkable conditions, chained in the dark, treated as nothing more than cargo for a company ledger. Section 5. Life and labor. So what did daily life actually look like on the ground? Well, at first, enslaved people were owned entirely by the VOC itself. They were kept in a highly controlled slave lodge at night and forced to work at the castle or on company farms during the day. But as those free burghers expanded their farms, they started purchasing enslaved people too. And as Van Riebeek's ledgers and the subsequent company records detail, a person's origin often dictated their agonizing labor. Enslaved people were brought in from all over: Africa, Madagascar, India, Ceylon, and the East Indies. According to the historical records, African individuals were usually assigned the most grueling physical labor. We're talking working the wheat fields, plowing, sieving grain, and digging roads and trenches. Those from the East were often forced to become artisans, carpenters, and tailors. Women were frequently assigned intense domestic work, like cooking on hot coal stoves, hauling water, and acting as wet nurses. Tragically, even Cape-born enslaved children were put to work on the farms and forced to care for younger children. And to make matters worse, any tiny wages an enslaved person might manage to earn in town generally belonged entirely to their owner. Section 6. Control and Resistance. To maintain this horrific system, the free burghers and the VOC exerted a level of control that was practically suffocating. Even for those performing highly skilled labor inside homes, life was heavily monitored, restricted, and filled with the constant, looming threat of violence. The official daily records document an absolute barrage of oppressive rules. Enslaved people had to be indoors by 10 p.m. They were straight up banned from riding horses or wagons in the streets. They were forced to go barefoot. They couldn't gather outside churches, meet in bars, or hang out on public holidays. They were forbidden from singing, whistling, or making any noise at all at night. The goal was total physical and psychological domination. Every single aspect of their existence was tightly controlled. A simple act like insulting a free person or making a so-called false accusation resulted in brutal flogging and being chained in irons. Now, the routine administrative records indicate that there were laws that supposedly protected enslaved people from extreme abuse. But let's be real. In reality, there was a complete and total lack of justice. It was incredibly difficult to report abuse because other enslaved people were terrified to act as witnesses. When cases actually did come forward, authorities almost always just believed the owner. Meanwhile, punishments for the enslaved were absolute. Whipping, starvation, and forced labor were just part of the grim, everyday reality. And if an enslaved person ever struck an owner, it was punishable by death. No questions asked. Which brings us right back to where we started, Jan van Riebeck's official journal. What began as a mundane, simple instruction to record the weather, log the planting of vegetables, and track the construction of a mud fort for a halfway refreshment station, inadvertently captured the total displacement of the Khoikhoi and the San, and the incredibly traumatic origins of a brutal slave society. It leaves us with a pretty provocative thought. If a simple, everyday bureaucratic journal could document such a massive, violent collision of worlds, what other routine administrative records sitting in dusty archives today might be hiding the true origins of our most profound historical divides? Keep questioning the history around you, and thanks for joining me for this explainer.